He made 31 feature films in 13 years. His first, Love Me Tender, came out in 1956 and was a massive hit. His last, Change of Habit, was released in 1969. For a time in the early 1960s, he was one of the highest paid actors in Hollywood, commanding $1 million per picture plus a huge percentage of the profits. The movies made money. The soundtrack albums made even more. From a business perspective, the strategy was a success. But that is not the whole story. Elvis Presley had real acting talent. Critics saw it, directors saw it, audiences saw it. In films like King Creole and Jailhouse Rock, there was a raw, dangerous energy. He had the potential to be a great actor, maybe even one of the greats. He idolized Marlon Brando and James Dean. He wanted to be taken seriously. So what happened? Why did the path that started with such promise end with a string of formulaic, critically panned comedies like Harum Skarum and Clambake? Why did the man who could have been a contender choose to become a caricature? The answers are not simple. They are tangled up in contracts, control, fear, and loyalty. They involve a carnival barker manager, a risk-averse Hollywood studio system, and Elvis's own complex psychology. His film career is one of the great what-ifs in entertainment history. It is a story of squandered potential on an epic scale, and it leaves us with questions. So many unanswered questions. Number 16. Why did he stop making movies? By 1969, Elvis was done. The Change of Habit was his 31st and final narrative film. He was only 34 years old. Most actors are just hitting their stride at that age. For Elvis, it was the end of a chapter he was desperate to close. The reason he stopped seems obvious on the surface. He hated the movies he was making, but the real story is about a perfect storm of creative rebirth, financial freedom, and a changing Hollywood. The most important event was the 1968 NBC television special, often called the 68 Comeback Special. It was produced by Steve Binder, a young, ambitious director who saw the artist buried under the movie Schmaltz. Binder pushed Elvis to ditch the cheesy Christmas theme the network wanted and instead do a raw, powerful music show. The result was electrifying. Dressed in black leather, Elvis looked incredible and sang with a passion not seen in years. He reconnected with his own power. He told stories, he sweated, he snarled. The special was a massive critical and commercial success. It reminded the world, and more importantly Elvis himself, that he was not a joke. He was the king of rock and roll. This rebirth gave him a new path. He immediately began planning his return to live performing. In July 1969, he opened at the International Hotel in Las Vegas. The shows were a phenomenon. He was selling out a massive showroom night after night, earning more money than he ever did from movies, and getting the artistic validation he craved. The stage, not the soundstage, was now his home. He had found a way out of the Hollywood trap. As biographer, Peter Guralnick documents in his book Careless Love, The Unmaking of Elvis Presley, the success in Vegas made the movies completely redundant. He no longer needed them for money or exposure. At the same time, Hollywood was changing. The old studio system that had churned out Elvis movies was dying. Films like Easy Rider and The Graduate were ushering in a new era of auteur directors and more complex adult stories. The light, formulaic musical comedies Elvis specialized in were becoming dinosaurs. The box office returns for his later films showed this. Live a Little, Love a Little, 1968, and Charo. Colonel Tom Parker, ever the pragmatist, could see the writing on the wall. The guaranteed profits were now in Vegas and on tour. Elvis himself was just tired of it. From members of his entourage, the Memphis Mafia, have repeatedly told stories of him physically cringing when he had to go to the studio. He would receive a script for a film like Paradise, Hawaiian Style, and just toss it aside in disgust. He knew the songs were terrible and the plots were absurd. He felt like a prisoner. The 68 special and the return to live music was his jailbreak. He had an alternative, and he took it. He chose the roar of a live crowd over the sterile boredom of a Hollywood set. He never looked back. What we still do not know is startling. If the Vegas shows had failed, would he have been forced to crawl back to Hollywood? Did Colonel Parker have any long-term film plans at all after 1969, or was the move to Vegas a final admission that the movie star dream was dead? And what if a new Hollywood director like Martin Scorsese or Francis Ford Coppola, who were just starting out, had approached him with a serious role in 1970? Would he have even considered it? Number 15 was his final stretch of films, a real attempt at change. Between 1968 and 1969, something shifted, however, briefly. After years of interchangeable comedies, Elvis made a string of films that felt different. Live a Little, Love a Little, Charo, The Trouble with Girls, and Change of Habit were not the typical travelogues. They represented a final, sputtering attempt to break the formula. But was it a genuine artistic push from Elvis, or just the studio trying anything to stop the box office slide? Live a Little, Love a Little, 1968, was a more adult-themed comedy. It had more sophisticated humor and even a psychedelic dream sequence. It was a clear departure from something like Clambake. Then came Charo, 1969, his most dramatic departure. It was a gritty western. Elvis grew a beard. He played a reformed outlaw. And most significantly, he did not sing on camera, with the title song only playing over the credits. This was a deliberate move to be seen as a serious actor. He was finally getting a chance to do something with more substance, a role closer to what he had wanted for years. The film was marketed as a tough, serious picture. The Trouble with Girls, 1969, was a period piece set in the 1920s with Elvis as the manager of a traveling Chautauqua show. It had a unique feel and a strong supporting cast, including Vincent Price. His final film, Change of Habit, 1969, was perhaps the strangest of all. Elvis played a doctor running a clinic in an inner-city neighborhood, working alongside three nuns in street clothes, one of whom was played by Mary Tyler Moore. The film tackled social issues like poverty, racism, and even autism. It was a message picture a million miles away from girls. Girls! Girls! So, what was going on? Part of it was Elvis. After the 68 comeback special, he had more confidence. He was pushing back at least a little. In the book, Elvis, My Best Man by his friend George Klein, Klein recounts how Elvis was genuinely excited about the script for Charo. They knew the old formula was failing. These films were experiments, attempts to rebrand Elvis for a changing audience. The problem was, they were half measures. Charo was supposed to be a much tougher film, in the vein of Clint Eastwood's spaghetti westerns. But the final script was watered down. Change of Habit had a socially conscious premise, but it was handled in a clumsy, often laughable way. The films were different, but they were not necessarily good. They were also poorly promoted. Audiences who wanted the old fun Elvis were confused, and audiences who wanted serious drama did not believe Elvis could deliver it. The attempts failed to find a new audience while alienating what was left of the old one. It was too little, too late. The lingering questions are haunting. Who was truly driving this change, Elvis, or the studio executives at MGM and Universal? Was Colonel Parker actively supporting these different roles, or just reluctantly agreeing to them because the old formula was no longer profitable? And if Charo had been a massive box office hit, would it have unlocked a new career for Elvis as a dramatic actor in the 1970s, or would he have still chosen to return to the stage? Number 14, how much did Colonel Parker's gambling control the choices? To understand Elvis's film career, you have to understand Colonel Tom Parker. And to understand the Colonel in the 1960s, you have to understand his gambling. It was not a hobby, it was a compulsion. And many believe it was the single biggest factor in the disastrous creative decisions of that decade. The need for a steady, massive, and predictable flow of cash to cover his casino debts may have condemned Elvis to a career of terrible movies. Colonel Parker was a notorious gambler long before Elvis hit it big, but when Elvis began his 7-year residency at the International Hotel in Las Vegas in 1969, Parker's access and his losses escalated dramatically. The hotel was more than happy to extend him millions of dollars in credit or markers. Why? Because his client, Elvis Presley, was the hotel's biggest asset, guaranteeing a packed house every night, as Parker's debt was the hotel's leverage over Elvis. This is meticulously detailed in Alana Nash's definitive biography, The Colonel, the Extraordinary Story of Colonel Tom Parker and Elvis Presley. She reveals that by the mid-1970s, Parker's debt to the Las Vegas Hilton, which the International became, was estimated to be as high as $30 million. How does this connect to the movies of the 1960s? The pattern was already set. The movie deals Parker signed were built for cash flow, not quality. He negotiated deals that paid a fixed, high salary up front and a percentage of the profits. He favored quantity over quality, pushing for 3 movies a year. A steady stream of million-dollar paychecks was perfect for a man who needed to service massive ongoing debts. A prestige project, a passion project, might take a year or more to develop. It might require a lower upfront salary in exchange for a larger back-end deal. It might even lose money. That was a risk the Colonel could not afford to take. The formulaic movies were a sure thing, a low budget, an exotic location, a handful of forgettable songs, and Elvis's name on the poster guaranteed a profit. It was a business model that minimized risk and maximized immediate cash. It was the perfect business model for a gambling addict. He was not managing an artist's career, he was managing his own credit line. He locked Elvis into long-term, multi-picture deals with producers like Hal Wallace at Paramount and with MGM. These contracts, signed years in advance, trapped Elvis on a treadmill. Even when Elvis was miserable and knew the films were terrible, the contractual obligations were ironclad. This explains Parker's infamous decision to turn down the role opposite Barbra Streisand in the 1976 remake of A Star is Born. His demands were outrageous. Top billing for Elvis over Streisand, and a non-negotiable salary of $1 million. Most insiders believe Parker deliberately sabotaged the deal. Why? A successful, serious film would have given Elvis new power and new connections in Hollywood. It might have led him to question Parker's judgment and control. It was safer for Parker to keep Elvis on the road, earning predictable money under his thumb in Las Vegas, where his own debts kept him in the hotel's pocket. We are left with chilling questions. Was every single film choice from Blue Hawaii onward dictated not by career strategy, but by the Colonel's latest trip to the casino? Did the studio heads know about Parker's addiction and use it as leverage to get Elvis for cheap, formulaic films? And the darkest question of all was keeping Elvis in a state of creative misery, a deliberate tactic by the Colonel to keep him dependent and easier to control, ensuring the cash cow would never wander off. Number 13, why didn't his own production company push for better scripts? In 1962, Elvis Presley, Colonel Parker, and producer Hal Wallace formed a production company. It was called Gladys Music, named after Elvis's beloved late mother. On the surface, this looked like a major step forward for Elvis, a move toward creative control. A star's own production company is supposed to be a vehicle for finding and developing better projects, for steering a career in a more personal direction. Paul Newman had one, Kirk Douglas had one, but Gladys Music did the opposite. It became just another cog in the machine that churned out bad movies. The structure of the deals was the heart of the problem. Gladys Music was essentially a company that held the publishing rights to the songs in Elvis's movies. As explained in books like Elvis and the Colonel, the real money was in the music. The typical deal worked like this. A studio like MGM would pay Elvis his $1 million salary. They would also require a soundtrack album with a dozen new songs. The writers of those songs would be signed to Gladys Music. This meant that every time a soundtrack album was sold or a single was played on the radio, the royalties flowed back to Elvis and the Colonel. This created a perverse incentive. The quality of the film became secondary to the need to shoehorn in as many songs as possible. The movie was no longer a story, it was a delivery system for a soundtrack album. This is why the plots became so flimsy and the musical numbers so nonsensical. Why is Elvis singing about clams on a beach in Clambake? Because the movie needed a song called Clambake for the album. The financial tail was wagging the artistic dog. Colonel Parker, who controlled the business side, saw this as a brilliant strategy. It doubled their income streams from every project. Elvis was the majority owner of Gladys Music, but he had little to do with its operations. He was not reading scripts, meeting with writers, or developing properties. That was the Colonel's domain, and the Colonel had no interest in developing artistically challenging material. His goal was to maximize profit and minimize risk. The established model of a movie tied to a soundtrack was a guaranteed moneymaker. Why would he mess with a winning formula, even if it was creatively bankrupt? The company never once optioned a serious book or developed a dramatic script. It never hired a top-tier writer. It was a production company in name only. It was actually a publishing company disguised as a film production house. It gave the illusion of control while actually reinforcing the very formula that was destroying Elvis's career. It was another one of the Colonel's brilliant, cynical business maneuvers that prioritized cash over art. The questions that remain are frustrating. Did Elvis ever understand the potential power he had with Gladys Music? Did he ever try to use the company to find a script he was passionate about? only to be blocked by the Colonel. And could a different business manager have used Gladys Music to build a legacy of quality films, turning it into a genuine creative force like Frank Sinatra's Artanis Productions, which produced films like Robin and the Seven Hoods? Number 12. Could he have been a serious actor like Brando or Dean? This is the central, most painful question of Elvis's film career. Was the potential real? Did he have the raw talent to be mentioned in the same breath as Marlon Brando, James Dean, or Montgomery Clift, the actors he so admired? The evidence from his early career suggests that the answer is a heartbreaking yes. Look at his performance in King Creole, 1958. Directed by Michael Curtiz, the acclaimed director of Casablanca, the film was a serious, atmospheric drama. Elvis played Danny Fisher, a troubled youth dragged into the criminal underworld of New Orleans. He held his own against a cast of veteran character actors, including Walter Matthau and Dean Jagger. The critics raved. The Hollywood Reporter said, "The film is Elvis Presley's best to date, a taut, well-made melodrama." A New York Times review from August 1958 called his performance surprisingly effective. He was not just a singer who could act a little. He was a natural. He had charisma, vulnerability, and a dangerous edge. Even earlier, in Jailhouse Rock 1957, you see that same fire. The famous dance sequence to the title song, which he choreographed himself, is a masterpiece of stylized aggression. His character, Vince Everett, is not a nice guy. He is arrogant, selfish, and angry. It was a complex, unsympathetic role, and Elvis embraced it. He was not afraid to be unlikable on screen. This is the mark of a serious actor, not a pop star trying to protect a clean image. These films were not accidents. He was working with good directors and good scripts. He was being challenged, and he was rising to the occasion. He studied his heroes. Members of the Memphis Mafia, like Jerry Schilling, have spoken about how Elvis would watch films like A Streetcar Named Desire and Rebel Without a Cause over and over, reciting the dialogue, analyzing the performances. He understood the craft. He wanted to be that good, legendary acting coach. Stella Adler, who taught Brando, reportedly saw his early work and said he had a great deal of potential. So what was lost? The post-Army films systematically stripped away his edge. He was always cast as the same character, a charming girl, crazy guy next door named Rusty, Chad, or Lucky. The scripts were safe, sanitized, and predictable. There was no room for the anger of Jailhouse Rock or the vulnerability of King Creole. The natural talent was still there, but it was buried under layers of formula and bad songs. He was being paid to not act, to just be a charming version of his own celebrity persona. The potential was slowly, systematically suffocated, one silly movie at a time. This leads to some deeply unsettling questions. Was his raw, rebellious talent actually seen as a threat by the Colonel in the studios, something to be tamed and commodified? If he had been given the lead in a film like The Defiant Ones or Cat on a Hot Tin Roof in the late 1950s, could he have changed the entire trajectory of his career before the Army? And when he looked in the mirror in 1965, did he still see the actor who made King Creole, or was that person completely gone? Number 11 was Hal Wallis a genius or a curse? Producer Hal Wallis was one of the most powerful men in Hollywood. He had produced classics like The Maltese Falcon and Casablanca. He had a keen eye for talent. He signed Elvis to a multi-picture deal with Paramount Pictures in 1956. For the next decade, Wallis would be one of the primary architects of Elvis's film career. But was he a mentor who guided a young star, or a factory boss who exploited a cash cow? In the beginning, the relationship was promising. Wallis put Elvis in his first few films and seemed to understand his appeal. He saw the raw energy and the charisma. But after Elvis returned from the Army in 1960, the strategy shifted dramatically. The first film under the new plan was GI Blues. It was light, fluffy, and full of songs. It was a huge hit. This was followed by Blue Hawaii in 1961, produced by Wallis. The film was shot on location, it was visually beautiful, and it was a box office phenomenon. The soundtrack album was #1 for 20 weeks. For Hal Wallis and Colonel Parker, Blue Hawaii was not a movie, it was a business model. They had found the formula. The Wallis-produced films of the 1960s, like Girls, Fun in Acapulco, and Paradise, Hawaiian Style, were all variations on this theme. Take Elvis, put him in an exotic location, surround him with beautiful women, add a dozen mediocre songs, and print money. From a financial perspective, Wallis was a genius. He created a low-risk, high-reward production line that made millions for himself, the studio, and Elvis. But for Elvis, the artist, Wallace was a curse. He had no interest in challenging Elvis or developing his acting talent. He saw him as a commodity. In a 1957 memo, Wallace wrote about the need to keep Elvis's character sympathetic, a clear sign that the dangerous edge of Jailhouse Rock was being deliberately smoothed away. The scripts Wallace approved were lazy and repetitive. The directors he hired were competent journeymen, not visionaries. He trapped Elvis in a gilded cage. Elvis grew to resent Wallace and the films he was making. There are many stories of Elvis's frustration on the set of Wallace Productions. He knew the material was bad. He would complain to his friends, but he felt powerless. He was locked into a long-term contract. Wallace and the Colonel had a comfortable, profitable relationship. They were the two wardens of Elvis's Hollywood prison. Wallace provided the formula, and the Colonel enforced the sentence. Wallace was not a villain in the traditional sense. He was a product of the old Hollywood system. He was a businessman first and an artist second. With Elvis, he simply followed the path of least resistance and greatest profit. The unanswered questions about Wallace are about his true motivations. Did he genuinely believe the formulaic musicals were the best use of Elvis's talent, or did he privately know he was squandering it for profit? Did he ever consider casting Elvis in a serious drama he was producing, or was that line never even crossed in his mind? And what would have happened if, after the success of Blue Hawaii, Wallace had said, "Okay, we've made our money. Now let's make a great film." Number 10. Why did he make 3 movies a year? The sheer volume of Elvis's film output in the 1960s is staggering. Between 1961 and 1969, he starred in 27 films. That is an average of 3 movies a year. No other major star of that era worked at such a frantic pace. As Frank Sinatra, a comparable singer-actor, made about 1 film a year during the same period. The relentless schedule was a key factor in the declining quality of his films and his own growing disillusionment. So why did he do it? The primary reason was the business model created by Colonel Parker and the studio heads. Each film was not a standalone project, it was part of a package. The package included the film, a soundtrack album, and singles for radio play. This created a continuous cycle of production and consumption. A new movie meant a new album, which kept Elvis on the charts and in the public eye between films. It was a brilliantly designed commercial loop. To keep this machine running, it needed a constant supply of new products. 3 movies a year fed the beast. The contracts reflected this. Parker signed Elvis to multi-picture deals that obligated him to this punishing schedule. For example, a 1961 deal with MGM required him to make 1 film a year for them. Combined with his commitments to Hal Wallace at Paramount and other studios, the 3-a-year schedule became locked in. These contracts were also financially lucrative. Elvis was guaranteed his $1 million salary for each picture. 3 pictures a year meant a guaranteed $3 million, an astronomical sum at the time. For a boy who grew up in poverty, this financial security was hard to resist. There was also a sense from the Colonel that they needed to strike while the iron was hot. Well, rock and roll was seen as a fad, and there was a fear that Elvis's popularity might not last. The strategy was to make as much money as possible, as quickly as possible. This short-term thinking prioritized immediate cash flow over long-term career building. It meant there was no time to wait for a good script or a great director. The production schedule was paramount. As soon as 1 film wrapped, the script for the next one was waiting. This pace had a devastating effect on quality. Good scripts take time to write and develop. Good films require pre-production and careful planning. The Elvis Movie Factory had no time for any of that. Scripts were often commissioned and written in a few weeks. The songs were often written to order, with titles dictated by the plot, like A Dog's Life for the film Paradise, Hawaiian Style. The result was a declining quality that was obvious to everyone, including Elvis. By the mid-60s, he was physically and creatively exhausted. The joy was gone. And he was just going through the motions, a prisoner of the schedule he had agreed to. Still, deep questions remain. Did Elvis ever try to use his star power to demand a slower pace? Perhaps 1 great film a year instead of 3 mediocre ones? Was the 3-a-year pace a deliberate strategy by Parker to keep Elvis too busy and tired to think about other creative avenues or question his management? And if he had made only a third of the films he did, would we now remember him as a respected actor instead of a movie caricature? Number 9. What was the real purpose of the travelogue movies? Starting with Blue Hawaii in 1961, a specific subgenre was born, the Elvis travelogue. The formula was simple and endlessly repeatable. Send Elvis to an exotic or glamorous location like Hawaii, Acapulco, or the Seattle World's Fair. Give him a job that puts him in contact with tourists and locals like a tour guide or a race car driver. Add a romantic subplot, a misunderstanding, and a dozen songs. The location was not just a setting, it was the main selling point. But why did this become the dominant format for his career? The first reason was visual appeal. In the early 1960s, international travel was still a luxury for most Americans. These films offered a cheap, vicarious vacation. Audiences could escape to sunny beaches and vibrant cities for the price of a movie ticket. Producers like Hal Wallace understood this. Filming on location, even for just a few key scenes, gave the movies a big budget, glamorous feel without the expense of a complex plot or high-priced co-stars. The posters for films like Fun in Acapulco and Viva Las Vegas always featured the location as prominently as Elvis himself. The travelogue format also solved a major narrative problem: how to justify the constant singing. If Elvis is a boat captain in Hawaii or a singer in a Las Vegas casino, it feels natural for him to break into song. The setting provided a built-in excuse for the musical numbers, no matter how flimsy. This was crucial for the business model that depended on selling soundtrack albums. The story was just a framework to hang the songs on, and the travelogue provided the most convenient and visually appealing framework possible. From Colonel Parker's perspective, this format was ideal. It was safe. There were no controversial themes, no complex characters, no political statements. It was pure escapist entertainment. This kept Elvis's image clean and marketable to the widest possible audience. The films were family-friendly and predictable. You knew what you were getting with an Elvis travelogue, and for a while, audiences loved it. But Blue Hawaii was the 10th highest grossing film of 1961. The model worked, but it came at a huge artistic cost. The emphasis on scenery and songs meant that character development and plot were neglected. And Elvis's character was essentially a tourist in his own movies. He was reactive, not active. Things happened to him, he rarely made them happen. The locations, as beautiful as they were, became a crutch. The films were so focused on showing you a good time that they forgot to tell you a good story. By the time he made Harum Skarum, 1965, where he is a movie star in a fictional Middle Eastern country, the formula had descended into self-parody. The most disturbing questions about this strategy persist. Was the travelogue format used to intentionally depoliticize and sanitize the rebellious rock and roller of the 1950s, making him a safer product for mainstream America? Did the constant travel and superficial nature of these films contribute to Elvis's own sense of detachment and isolation? And what if he had made a travelogue set in a gritty, realistic location like New York City or his native Memphis? A film that actually explored the culture instead of just using it as a pretty backdrop. Number 8. Why did he never work with a great director again? Elvis Presley's early film career included two very good, very different directors. Richard Thorpe, who directed Jailhouse Rock, was a skilled studio veteran who knew how to handle action and drama. And Michael Curtiz, the director of King Creole, was a genuine Hollywood legend, an Oscar winner responsible for Casablanca and Mildred Pierce. These directors challenged Elvis. They saw his potential and pushed him to deliver real performances. After he returned from the army, he never worked with a director of that caliber again. Why not? The simple answer is that the films he was making did not require or attract top-tier directors. The post-army formula called for a director who was efficient, not one who was an artist. The job was to get the film shot on time and on budget, make sure the musical numbers were filmed competently, and not cause any trouble. The directors like Norman Taurog, who directed an astonishing 9 Elvis movies, or Gordon Douglas, were reliable studio hands. They were journeymen, not auteurs. They were good at their jobs, but their job was to deliver a commercial product, not a work of art. A great director like Elia Kazan or Stanley Kramer, who were making landmark films in the 1960s, would have demanded a good script. They would have wanted creative control. They would have wanted to explore the darker, more complex sides of a character. None of this was compatible with the Elvis movie machine. Colonel Parker and Hal Wallace had no interest in collaborating with a director who might have his own vision for the film. They wanted someone who would follow the blueprint. A strong director would have been a threat to their control. There is also the question of whether Elvis himself was willing to fight for a better director. By the mid-60s, he was deep into a cycle of creative apathy. He knew the films were bad, but he had seemingly given up trying to make them better. Pushing for a specific director would have meant a confrontation with the Colonel, a battle Elvis was rarely willing to wage. It was easier to show up, say the lines, sing the songs, collect the check, and go home. His passivity enabled the system to continue. Director Don Siegel, who later directed Dirty Harry, worked with Elvis on the 1960 Western Flaming Star. Siegel was a tough, no-nonsense director who was impressed with Elvis's talent and work ethic. He saw the potential for Elvis to become a major dramatic actor, a successor to someone like John Wayne or Robert Mitchum. In his autobiography, A Siegel Film, he lamented what happened to Elvis's career, blaming the idiots who surrounded him for putting him in a series of stupid musicals. The experience with Siegel shows what was possible, but Siegel was the exception, not the rule. He was the last truly interesting director Elvis would ever work with. The unanswered questions are about missed opportunities. Did any great directors of the era ever approach the Colonel about working with Elvis, only to be rejected? What kind of performance could a director like John Frankenheimer or Sidney Lumet have gotten out of him? And did Elvis ever watch a film like The Hustler or To Kill a Mockingbird and feel a deep sense of regret for the kind of collaborations he was missing out on? Number 7. Did he actually hate his movies as much as people say? The standard narrative is that Elvis despised his own films, at least the ones he made in the 1960s. There's a lot of evidence to support this. Members of the Memphis Mafia have told countless stories about his frustration. In his book, Me and a Guy Named Elvis, Jerry Schilling recounts how Elvis would complain bitterly about the ridiculous plots and the terrible songs he was forced to sing. He famously loathed the song Old MacDonald, which he had to sing in the film Double Trouble. There are on-set stories of him openly mocking the scripts. During the filming of Harum Scarum, a film he particularly hated, he reportedly complained to the director that the story was written by someone who had never been to the Middle East and thought it was just a bunch of sand. His co-stars often noticed his lack of enthusiasm. Shelley Fabares, who appeared in 3 of his films, has spoken about how professional he was, but also hinted at a sadness and a sense that he was not being creatively fulfilled. His physical appearance in the later films tells its own story. The vibrant, energetic star of Viva Las Vegas 1964 looks bored and bloated in Clambake 1967. However, the picture might be more complicated. At the beginning of his career, he was immensely proud of his films. He loved the process of acting and took it seriously. He was thrilled to be in Hollywood, working with famous directors and actors. Even after the Army, he was initially excited about films like GI Blues and Blue Hawaii. They were huge hits, and success is a powerful bomb. It is also possible that his hatred was not for all of them, but for the worst of them. He likely had a soft spot for some of the more fun, successful ones, like Viva Las Vegas, which had great musical numbers and genuine chemistry with Anne Margaret. His frustration was likely cumulative. The first silly comedy might have been tolerable. The 10th was soul-destroying. We also have to consider Elvis's personality. He was a people-pleaser, he was loyal to the Colonel, and felt a responsibility to keep his large entourage employed. Complaining was one thing, but taking action to change his situation was another. He may have vented his frustration privately, but felt publicly obligated to promote the films and go through the motions. His hatred was real, but it was coupled with a sense of resignation. He was trapped, and he knew it. He hated the trap, not necessarily every single moment inside it. This interpretation is supported by comments from friends who said he would sometimes enjoy the camaraderie of the film set, even if he disliked the project itself. This complexity leaves us with some difficult questions. Was there a specific film or a specific moment that marked the turning point, where his attitude shifted from professional acceptance to genuine hatred? Did he differentiate in his own mind between the good bad movies and the bad movies? And if he had been offered a truly great script in the middle of that terrible run, say in 1966, did he still have enough creative fire left to recognize it and fight for it? Number 6 was King Creole: The Career he actually wanted. Of all his films, King Creole, 1958, stands apart. It represents a tantalizing glimpse of a career path not taken. It was a serious, critically acclaimed drama based on a respected novel directed by an A-list director and featured a strong supporting cast. It was, by any measure, a prestige picture, and Elvis was magnificent in it. The question is, was this a one-off, or was this the kind of career Elvis and his most ardent supporters dreamed he would have? The evidence suggests this was exactly what he wanted. Elvis idolized actors like James Dean and Marlon Brando, actors known for their intense, naturalistic performances in serious dramas. King Creole gave him a chance to be that kind of actor. His character, Danny Fisher, was complex. He was a good kid in a bad situation, torn between his family and the lure of crime. The role required real acting, not just charisma. Michael Curtiz, the director, did not treat him like a pop star. He treated him like an actor. According to reports from the set, Curtiz was tough on Elvis, demanding multiple takes and pushing him to dig deep. Elvis responded to the challenge. He later said that King Creole was his favorite of all his films. The project itself was a statement of intent. It was based on the Harold Robbins novel, A Stone for Danny Fisher. This was not a flimsy story cooked up to sell records. It was a legitimate literary property. The studio, Paramount, put real resources into it, hiring a top director and cast. They believed in Elvis as a dramatic actor. At this point in his career before the Army, the momentum was building for him to become just that. He had proven he could carry a musical like Jailhouse Rock and a drama like King Creole. The future looked limitless. Then came the Army. When he returned 2 years later, the landscape had changed. The Colonel had negotiated new contracts, and the focus shifted entirely to the safe, profitable musical comedies. The King Creole path was abandoned. It is one of the great tragedies of his career. He had proven he could do it. He had the talent, the desire, and the critical acclaim. But the business interests around him pointed him in a different, much less artistically rewarding direction. Every few years, there would be a glimmer of that old promise. A film like Flaming Star 1960, a serious Western where he played a mixed-race character caught between two worlds, showed he still had the dramatic chops. But these were isolated exceptions. The dominant trend was away from drama and toward fluff. The career he could have had, the one that started with King Creole, became a ghost that haunted the rest of his Hollywood years. The what-ifs are almost too painful to consider. If he had not gone into the Army, would he have made another film with Michael Curtiz? What would his career have looked like if he had made a string of dramas in the early 1960s, a time when Hollywood was producing some of its most iconic films? And did he ever rewatch King Creole late at night at Graceland and wonder about the actor he might have become? Number 5, did the Army really ruin his acting ambitions? Elvis Presley was drafted into the U.S. Army in March 1958. He served for 2 years, spending most of that time stationed in Germany. On the surface, it was a public relations triumph. He served as a regular soldier, earning the respect of the public and shedding his rebellious image. But for his acting career, those 2 years were a catastrophic interruption. It is not an exaggeration to say that the actor who went into the Army was not the same one who came out. Before the Army, Elvis was on a clear upward trajectory as a serious actor. He had just completed King Creole, his best and most dramatic film. He was gaining confidence and critical respect. He was still raw, still dangerous, still connected to the restless energy that had made him a star. He was, as Peter Guralnick titled his first volume of biography, on the last train to Memphis. He was an artist in motion. The 2 years in the Army put everything on hold. It was a creative deep freeze. While he was away, Hollywood changed. More importantly, Colonel Parker had 2 years without his client to think and plan. He saw how the world reacted to Elvis, the soldier patriotic, clean-cut, and safe. The Colonel decided that this was the image to sell going forward. The rebellious rock and roller was to be retired, replaced by an all-American boy. This decision would have profound consequences for his film roles. When Elvis returned, the first project waiting for him was not a gritty drama, but the light musical comedy G.I. Blues. The title alone tells you everything. It was a film designed to capitalize on his Army service and his new, safer image. It was a huge commercial success, and it set the template for almost everything that followed. The momentum he had built as a dramatic actor was completely lost. The 2-year gap had allowed the Colonel to pivot his career in a new, more profitable, and less artistically ambitious direction. There was also a personal toll. Elvis's mother, Gladys, died while he was on leave from the Army. It was a devastating blow, from which he never fully recovered. Friends have said that something in him broke after her death. He returned a more subdued, more compliant man. The fire and anger that fueled his early performances seemed to have been banked. He was more willing to go along with the Colonel's plan, less willing to fight for his own artistic vision. The army did not just interrupt his career, it changed him as a person, and that change was reflected on screen. The lingering questions are profound. If he had been able to get a deferment or serve in a way that allowed him to continue making films, could he have maintained his dramatic momentum? Was the colonel's post-army strategy a brilliant business move or a cynical betrayal of his client's artistic talent? And is it possible that without the trauma of his mother's death during that period, Elvis would have come back with more fight in him, refusing to make the films that were laid out for him? Number 4. Who was more to blame, Elvis or the Colonel? This is the ultimate debate among Elvis fans and historians. Who was responsible for the squandering of his acting potential? Was it the manipulative manager, Colonel Tom Parker, who saw his client as nothing more than a product? Or was it Elvis himself, the man who ultimately had the power to say no, but rarely if ever did? The truth is that blame lies with both, in a tragic and complex partnership. The case against Colonel Parker is overwhelming. He was a carnival huckster at heart, a master of promotion and deal-making, but he had no understanding or appreciation of art. His primary goal was always to make the most money in the shortest amount of time with the least amount of risk. The movie and soundtrack formula of the 1960s was his creation. He locked Elvis into long-term contracts that guaranteed a steady stream of terrible films. He isolated Elvis from the rest of Hollywood, handling all business and often refusing to let directors or producers speak to Elvis directly. His infamous sabotage of the A Star is Born opportunity is perhaps the most damning piece of evidence. He consistently prioritized control and cash flow over his client's artistic aspirations. As Alana Nash's biography makes clear, Parker's own needs, including his gambling addiction, often dictated the career choices. But Elvis was not a helpless child. He was an adult and the biggest star in the world. He had immense power, even if he was reluctant to use it. He could have fired the colonel at any time. He could have refused to show up on set. He could have put his foot down and demanded better scripts. He never did. Why? Part of it was loyalty. The colonel had made him a star and made him rich. Elvis came from a culture where loyalty was paramount. Firing the man who guided him from the beginning would have felt like a profound betrayal. There was also a deep-seated insecurity. Elvis was terrified of his fame disappearing. The colonel's safe, formulaic approach guaranteed continued success, even if it was unfulfilling. A risky dramatic role could fail, and Elvis had an intense fear of failure. It was easier to be unhappy and successful than to risk being a happy failure. He also had a huge payroll. He supported his father, his grandmother, and the entire Memphis Mafia and their families. The steady income from the movies paid for all of it. Rocking the boat would have put all of that at risk. So he complained in private but complied in public. He became a willing participant in his own artistic demise. It was a toxic codependency. The colonel needed Elvis's talent to generate money and feed his own demons. Elvis needed the colonel's business acumen to provide the security and structure he craved. So Parker controlled the business, but Elvis controlled the talent. If either one had acted differently, the story could have changed. Parker could have aimed higher, and Elvis could have demanded more. Neither did. The questions that remain cut to the very heart of their relationship. Did the colonel genuinely believe he was doing what was best for Elvis, or was it pure self-interest? And did Elvis's passivity come from a place of loyalty and fear, or did some part of him simply lack the ambition and the discipline to be a truly great actor? Was he, in the end, more comfortable being a movie star than an artist? Number 3. Why did he turn down A Star is Born? In 1975, Elvis was offered a role that could have changed everything. Barbra Streisand and her partner, producer John Peters, wanted him to co-star in their rock and roll remake of the classic film A Star is Born. The role of the self-destructive, fading rock star John Norman Howard seemed tailor-made for him. It was a complex, dramatic part that would have allowed him to draw on his own life experiences. It was a chance for a legitimate acting comeback in a major Hollywood film opposite one of the biggest stars in the world. He wanted to do it, but the deal never happened. Why? The official story, and the one that is almost certainly true, is that Colonel Tom Parker killed the deal. His negotiations were so outrageous that they seemed designed to fail. First, he demanded top billing for Elvis. Streisand was the bigger movie star at that point and the driving force behind the project. She was always going to get top billing. Second, He demanded a non-negotiable salary of $1 million plus 50% of the profits, a deal far exceeding what a supporting actor would typically command. The studio, Warner Brothers, balked, but the most bizarre demand, as recounted by John Peters and others involved, was Parker's refusal to let anyone see Elvis's contract with him. When the studio's lawyers asked for a copy to do their due diligence, Parker refused. He simply would not allow it. This was an impossible request. No studio would sign an actor without being able to verify his legal status with his manager. It was a deal breaker, and Parker knew it. He effectively sabotaged the negotiations from the start. Why would he do this? The most common theory is control. A successful comeback in a serious film would have given Elvis immense new power and prestige. He would have been exposed to a new generation of agents, producers, and directors. He might have realized that he no longer needed the Colonel. Parker could not risk losing control of his only client. It was safer to keep Elvis on the road, performing in Las Vegas and on tour, where Parker controlled every aspect of the business. The film would have also required Elvis to be vulnerable, to play a character who was an alcoholic and whose career was in decline. This was perhaps too close to home, and Parker was fiercely protective of the Elvis image, even if that image was now a caricature. Elvis was reportedly devastated. He was excited about the project and the chance to work with Streisand. When he learned the deal was dead, he was angry and depressed. It was a final, crushing confirmation that as long as the Colonel was in charge, his dreams of being a serious actor would never be realized. The role eventually went to Chris Christopherson, who earned a Golden Globe for his performance. The film was a massive box office hit. It was Elvis's last best chance, and it was stolen from him. The final, chilling questions remain. Was there ever a moment when Elvis considered firing the Colonel and taking the role anyway? Did Parker's fear of losing control outweigh any concern for Elvis's own happiness and artistic fulfillment? And what would the last few years of Elvis's life have been like if he had made that film, if he had received critical acclaim and rediscovered his passion for acting? Could it have saved him? Number 2, what if he had said no to Blue Hawaii? It is hard to overstate the importance of Blue Hawaii. The 1961 film was a colossal success. It cemented Elvis's image as a wholesome, romantic leading man. Its soundtrack album was a blockbuster, staying at number 1 on the charts for 20 weeks. But more than anything, it created the formula that would define and ultimately destroy his movie career. The travelogue, the light romance, the dozen-plus songs, the predictable plot, it all started here. What if he had said no? Imagine a different timeline. Elvis returns from the army in 1960. He makes GI Blues, a transitional film that cashes in on his service, but then, instead of heading to Hawaii, he decides to follow up the serious Western flaming star with another dramatic role. He uses his immense box office power to demand a better script, a more interesting character, a real director. He chooses the path of King Creole over the path of the musical comedy. The immediate financial returns might have been smaller, but a gritty drama would not have produced a blockbuster soundtrack album full of hit singles. Well, Colonel Parker would have been furious. Producer Hal Wallace would have been disappointed. They would have pushed him to do the easier, more profitable film. But if Elvis had held firm, the studios would have had to listen. He was too big a star to lose. He could have dictated his own terms. In this alternate reality, the 1960s look very different. Instead of 3 films a year, he makes 1. He works with directors like John Frankenheimer, Arthur Penn, or Sam Peckinpah. He takes on challenging roles. He might have starred in a film like The Cincinnati Kid. The role went to Steve McQueen, or HUD, the role went to Paul Newman. He would have been seen as a peer of those actors, not as a joke. His filmography would be smaller but infinitely more respectable. He would have grown as an actor, and his passion for the craft would have been nurtured, not extinguished. Of course, this is all speculation, but the decision to make Blue Hawaii and its subsequent success closed the door on that other reality. Its profitability was its curse. It proved to the Colonel and the studios that the safe, easy formula was the way to go. Why risk making a serious drama that might fail when you could make a musical comedy that was a guaranteed hit? The success of Blue Hawaii made it almost impossible for Elvis to escape the formula. He became a victim of his own success. Every film that followed was an attempt to recapture that magic, and each attempt was a paler, more cynical imitation of the last. The what-ifs are staggering. If he had rejected the Blue Hawaii formula, would he have even needed to return to live performing in 1969, or would he have been a satisfied, respected film actor? Could a career of serious films have kept him more engaged and creatively alive, possibly preventing the personal decline of his later years? And does the entire tragic arc of his career hinge on this single pivotal choice? Number 1, was Elvis afraid of his own talent? This is perhaps the most difficult and personal question of all. Beyond the Colonel, the contracts, and the bad scripts, was there something inside Elvis himself that held him back? Was he, on some level, afraid of the very thing he said he wanted to be, a great dramatic actor? Elvis Presley was a man of contradictions. He was the most famous person in the world, yet he was deeply insecure. He projected an image of supreme confidence on stage, but in private, he could be shy and uncertain. He came from extreme poverty, and the fear of returning to that life never left him. This fear drove his incredible work ethic, but it also made him incredibly risk-averse. The formulaic movies, as unsatisfying as they were, represented security. They were a guaranteed paycheck. A serious dramatic role was a risk. What if he tried his best and failed? What if the critics savaged him? The public humiliation would have been devastating for a man of his pride and insecurity. It was safer to be criticized for making bad movies than to be criticized for being a bad actor. There is also the matter of discipline. Being a great actor requires more than just raw talent. It requires dedication, study, and a willingness to be vulnerable and emotionally exposed. Elvis had the talent, but did he have the discipline? His life in the 1960s was one of incredible indulgence, surrounded by an entourage that catered to his every whim. He was isolated from the real world. This is not an environment that fosters the kind of emotional honesty required for great acting. It is possible that the hard work of creating a complex character was more than he was willing or able to do. It was easier to play a slightly fictionalized version of himself. His loyalty to the Colonel and his entourage also played a part. To truly pursue a serious acting career would have meant breaking with the Colonel, the man he saw as a father figure. It would have meant disrupting the comfortable financial situation of everyone who depended on him. That would have been a massive emotional and psychological leap, one he may not have been capable of making. He was trapped by his own loyalty and his own image. In the end, he might have been a brilliant actor who was terrified of what it would take to be a brilliant actor. The potential was there. We saw it in King Creole. Directors saw it. But unlocking that potential would have required a fight he was not willing to have, a risk he was not willing to take, and a vulnerability he was not willing to show. It was easier to remain the king, even if it meant being the king of a kingdom of bad movies. This leaves us with the most profound and unanswered questions of all. Did Elvis secretly believe he was not good enough? That the success of King Creole was a fluke he could not repeat? Was his compliant nature a sign of loyalty, or was it an excuse to avoid the terrifying challenge of true artistic greatness? And ultimately, who was Elvis Presley more afraid of disappointing, his manager, his fans, or himself?